Hello. For this podcast, we decided to touch up on the topic of transnational families in an Asian American context. My name is Sannie.
I'm Grant.
I'm Joanna.
Briahna and Neven is currently not present. They were working on the other half of the project while we will be taking charge of the podcast. We wanted to touch up on this topic because we found it very fascinating in a bunch of different contexts, and we wanted to discuss the formation of transnational families using the knowledge that we have accumulated today.
Yeah, one particular reason why we really were interested in this topic is we really found it interesting how transnational families as a concept have really started to restructure like how we think about families in general, and particularly by the ways that families are forced to adapt to different conditions, either being in the new country or in the old country and dealing with a parent who has already gone abroad or something like that.
I guess we'll start off by kind of discussing what our conceptualization of transnational families are. And one of the most common transnational families are families where the mother is usually like a migrant worker coming from a less economically developed country to a more economically developed country where there's more job opportunities. What do you guys think about transnational families? Like, how would we...
Go ahead.
I think one particular thing to emphasize about transnational families is just how this isn't something that really had to be a major issue for people, like even just a couple hundred years ago. But this is something that really capitalism has really dragged into the world stage, and the increased interconnectivity of nations nowadays and cultures has really enabled this kind of like globe hopping for work. And this is just like an interesting, like tying it into economic theory can really kind of help conceptualize this in like a modern concept.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting how you brought up like modern. Speaking from like my family's personal experiences, I think in like the early 1900s. I guess kind of what we talked about in lecture 2 about like male migrant workers coming over to the U.S. And actually, my great-grandfather was one of those migrant workers who came from like southern China to like, I think he was in L.A. or Arizona, I don't remember, to work. And then unlike like now where these migrant workers, now they have like technology and like other means that we'll talk about later to kind of act as like a, what do they call it, surrogate caregiver?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, to continue on their caregiving roles with their children now, where it's like in the past where these opportunities to work elsewhere were still available, but the means of like keeping the family together weren't necessarily as feasible. So as we're talking about technology and keeping the family together, what do you guys think about like these like indirect means of still keeping in touch with your family? Like, is it, well, of course it's not sufficient, but like,
I think technology, there's a lot of technological advances nowadays, like with FaceTime, with Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp. There's a lot of apps that are actually very popular in Asian countries. WhatsApp, Kakao Talk, that allows you to continually...
like the chocolate cacao?
Yeah. Like, continually just communicate with each other in just a really easier way, and I believe, like, more financially easier. Because without, like, you don't have to, like, actually use texting, then you don't have to waste, like, your minutes or something like that. You just talk with each other over Wi-Fi. I mean, personally, that's how I communicate with my family members that are overseas, or with my friends go to Korea, Thailand. That's how we talk. In a normal hour, of course, because when they go to sleep, we wake up, so it's a little bit different. But I feel like with these technological like advances now, it makes it way easier to communicate with everyone, and you can just keep in touch. And even there's indirect communication where you're not talking to each other directly, but by updating each other like on each other's like social media feeds, you can kind of keep each other updated in each other's lives, so it doesn't feel that distant when you guys actually talk.
Kind of as an example, when you talk to your extended family abroad, how do you feel like that makes you like how do you feel like that helps you like cope with like almost like two identities of like your like upbringing here and your family there, like because that really ties into like the broader experience.
For sure, it's definitely different considering when I went to. It's similar to the experience when I went over to Vietnam and I talked to them directly. The way that another culture speaks, talks, like communicate is very different to how we do over here. Like, I mean, that goes for every culture. But, like, for example, in Vietnam, they use a lot of slang, and we have a lot of slang, and then they a lot, like we use, like, LOL in texting, right? Like, laugh out loud. Over there, they use, like, and I was like, I didn't know what that meant at all. And it's just very different because that's how their culture works, their language, their slang, and everything. And it feels like whenever I talk to them, I kind of slowly integrate that type of slang and language in the way that I speak. So it kind of feels like I'm slowly, kind of gradually integrating and learning the culture that I wasn't really associated with.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider too, because transnational families, like, it almost, I'd say like the core message would just be like, in terms of trying to identify with like the people in the country you moved to and back at home, like it really can't be understated how much of a challenge it can be when you're trying to like connect with people back at home too, because you've grown up almost in a different culture. Like I went to Vietnam a couple months ago, and I went with my friend who is his family's Vietnamese, and he speaks like pretty much perfect Vietnamese. But he went over there, and like people would immediately just like know he's like an outsider, and he definitely felt like he was being treated differently when he was there, even though he like had the upbringing like as a Vietnamese family, but because like he grew up in America and he had these different mannerisms and everything, like people like definitely could tell.
I feel like that's a term where like whitewashed, quote unquote, like whitewash comes in, where people think that because like you're born over here, you behave a different way and you don't really have any roots to your culture. I was lucky, so from growing up, like my parents like kind of forced me to speak Vietnamese, so they're afraid of me like losing my roots. So when I went back, I tried my best to speak in Vietnamese. Of course, there are like a few words here and there, or a lot of words here and there that I didn't really know. And I would kind of try to pass by saying the English word in a really like Vietnamese accent, and that worked for the most part. Like, but I mean, like a lot of people didn't know that I was born over there or born over here. They thought I was Vietnamese, like born. So a lot of people were like, "Oh, when did you go to the U.S.?" I was like, "I was born there." And then once like they said that, I was like, "Yes, I'm in." They believe I'm one of them.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how I guess like most of the current literature and like scholarly articles do focus on like immediate families where like one of the parent is away, and how they kind of navigate like, so I guess the larger term like transnational families applies to them in the sense that like their immediate family is like transnational, and how like navigating those boundaries, or like it's like kind of figuring out like who their like parents are, who they are, and how they keep those ties. But like in like a broader sense, like as we're speaking about our experiences as like third or second or first generation Asian Americans, like transnational families, it's like for us, like at least for me, like I define it as a sense where it's like how I can connect with my extended family, like I don't know, like my mom's cousins, like whoever, like my dad's uncles, like whoever, like random family members, and it's like almost like a not necessarily like the same in the same sense where it's like the smaller transnational families where the parents are away. Like I feel like for us it's almost like through our extended family members who are like in a different nation, we're like navigating like our own identity and like who we really are.
Yeah, one thing you said earlier about like how important like language was. I think that's something to really consider, especially like when you're in the new country that like your family is transferred to. One thing that like came up a lot in the readings was how important like almost like a network of other people from like the same transnational situation, like how that can form like through like shared like things such as language or shared upbringing. And I was just wondering like what you guys thought about how like these communities can form, how that kind of works as like a coping mechanism to like get through it.
That is a very packed question to unpack.
Very wise question, Grant.
Like one example that came up in the readings specifically, like one that I was like thinking about was how they were talking about like whether they gave their kids the choice of whether or not to like celebrate Christmas or something.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have like multiple holidays from different cultures, I think that can be like a really interesting, like, almost like this like dual upbringing.
It's actually funny. Growing up, my family, or my mom's side of the family, would be more into like celebrating holidays, or like I guess American holidays, where we would actually have like an actual Christmas tree, presents. They would make food like mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, and that's not what we eat at all. Like we eat rice and soup and noodles and just a lot of these like really new, like unique of variety of flavor of dishes. And for them to cook like that, I liked it because I kind of felt quote unquote normal, because everyone in my group or everyone in my class would be like, oh yeah, we had a Christmas celebration and we had like turkey and we had this and that, and like it's not that we don't want to celebrate it, it's just sometimes we just don't. And we have our own food, we go out to eat for this and that, and I feel like a lot of the time we celebrate it because we feel like we have to, because everyone else is doing it, and slowly we stopped bringing out the Christmas tree because it was like, oh, there's a lot of work, it's really dirty and this and that. We stopped making like the American dishes, and we just kind of continued on like it was every other day. Like the only thing that we kind of noted, like, oh yeah, Costco's closed. Like yeah. Places are closed, like we can't go. It's just a normal day for us. Sure, Christmas is Christmas, we'll be like, oh yeah, Merry Christmas, this and that, but it's just like another normal day.
Do you think that like when you like don't like grow up with like a holiday or something like that, you think that can be like distancing in terms of like making friends and stuff, like they don't have like these shared like Christmas experiences?
It's definitely a little weird because like I feel like growing up not celebrating like the traditional holidays, like traditional like everyone else, everyone came back to school from break or came back to work from break or this and that, and be like, oh yeah, I did this on Christmas, oh yeah, we went caroling and we went this. I was like, why would you sing in front of a stranger's house? Like I didn't understand the tradition, I didn't get it, and the only thing that I could get reference from was like from movies, from like Hallmark movies. So that was weird in a sense, where sometimes when you were young, kids can be mean and kids can be cruel. So when you're young, you're kind of just like, oh yeah, I experienced that too, just because your fear of being picked on and being distanced from like the rest of the class. So you're like, oh yeah, I totally did that too. When in reality, I saw that in like a Christmas movie. Like that's what happened.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
How would you guys think that, like, children whose, like, parents are away for, like, work reason, like the migrant worker parents, like, how are they, like, going back to resilience and coping, and sort of, like, in big holidays like that, like, how would they kind of navigate, like...
Are you talking about, like, in the country that they moved
their country
to,
of origin.
or the country of origin?
Yeah, like while their parents are away.
Something that really came up a lot was
like
how they
articles?
were surprised by how resilient like kids in like the original country would be, because they had such like a strong family community and support system. And I thought that was really interesting because that kind of ties into like the question in this class we've talked about a lot, like redefining family.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can family be like a community or something like that?
Yeah.
That's like a really interesting question when you think about it that way, because it seems like, although it obviously must be a challenge to grow up without a parent or nearby, like it seems like this can actually be like a really helpful way of making sure they still grow up like well-adjusted with support, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think I've noticed like similar trends in some of the articles that we've read too about how, like these children who are, I guess, more or less used to like a lot of changes in their day-to-day lives because like they have at least one parent being away, that they're more adaptable to changes and they're more resilient to like different things going on in their lives as well. I think one of the articles actually said that when, like, let's say the mother is away for work in another country, they usually hire another woman to take over the caregiving responsibilities for the family where the mother is a migrant worker. So then it's like almost creates this whole like caregiving chain, and then it ties back into how do you conceptualize family, and it's almost like it's like a privilege to like have, let's say, like the family in the wealthy country, they have a migrant worker like helping their family, and then like and then in the migrant workers country of origin, like they have another like lower class woman helping them. So yeah, what do you guys think about how like just claiming the idea of a family would like tie into like different classes within
What
different
you
countries?
mentioned actually, it's interesting because it kind of redefines the word family almost.
Mhm.
Because hiring having a migrant worker that is out of the country, hiring another person as a substitute caregiver for their family, from being with them from so long and growing up with them, like they are almost a member of the family. So it kind of redefines the traditional term of family of being only like a mother, a father, children, and has to be like this close-knit family, where it could be other people who aren't related to you, could be like distance family. So I think it's cool that we're kind of opening up that definition for more interpretation depending on each person's situation.
Yeah, it's interesting with that idea too of like bringing in like almost like a surrogate mother to like take care of like the upbringing. It like there's a lot of parallels in that between like cultural traditions and family traditions, where if you're looking at like cultural traditions, like we've been talking about, like, oh, you're growing up like in America or something, you're like taking in the traditions of like either like your community and like the people that are around you. But then like in a more like smaller level, like when you have like this like surrogate mother, or like you have this other family who's like taking part in raising you, you might have like different sets of family traditions that might even isolate you from your parents or something like that. And that's like culturally you will like have a lot more in common, but that kind of distance from a parent, like there must, I would expect there would be some kind of challenges in that.
I guess there's like no like real or correct answer to this, but it almost seems like there's like no fine line between like the quote unquote family is like having individuals take on roles of like mother, father, like children, but then at the same time like just having like a mother, even if they're in like a separate country, like if you're able to connect with like your biological mother, like that is like being a family too. So it's like this, like almost having both, like a physical person there taking on the motherly roles, and like having someone you know that you can be like, oh, that's my mom, and I can like text her even though she's in like, I don't know, wherever she is working.
There were, I believe, 3 different styles of mothering in transnational culture. It was intensive, collaborative, and passive. Intensive was defined as like very hands-on, like they call and they text each other. The mother makes a huge effort to call and text each other to make sure that they're still connected, they still have like a strong bond. Collaborative is, let's see, may mother alongside another caregiver who resides in the same country. So probably they're a migrant worker, and they kind of have like a, I guess like a surrogate or like a substitute, kind of helping alongside with maybe the dad who's still in the family or the mom that's still in the family, and kind of help parent the children. Passive was very depressing because it was the mother feeling like this intense kind of coming on of guilt and just depression because she was away from her children for long periods of time. But in the story that we read regarding the Filipino transnational family, what was interesting to me that I saw, there was kind of like a gender divide in a very like intensive mothering style with her transnational family. When she tried to connect and care for her family, one of the ways was sending presents and sending money. She would send money differently and expected to be taken care of differently. She sent money to her son, and her son has his own personal allowance. He doesn't have to divide it or share it with anyone. But you send money to the daughter, and the daughter feels a responsibility of kind of dispersing it along with every other member of the family. What do you feel, or how do you guys feel about that gender divide?
Is it? It's kind of like an unspoken like obligation for the daughter to look out for.
She's kind of like just expected to kind of take on that family role. I don't think no one actually specifically told the daughters to do it like that, as in disperse the allowance upon other family members. She kind of felt like she had to do it.
I feel like it almost sets the stage for the daughter to become like a migrant worker when she grows up too.
Right.
And I think there's like multiple factors that play. Whereas like you have like the idea of like traditional gender roles where like women are expected to like be caring for the family in a lot of these societies, and like you can kind of see how that cultural expectation of support that can sometimes put a lot of pressure on the women in these families and in these relationships to like really be stepping up, and that can like put a lot of strain on a family. And one of the interesting readings that we had, the one from Peng and Wong, where they're talking about communication technologies, when they're talking about how it's important for when they're talking about how incorporating men into childcare, that can be really beneficial to mental health and upbringing. It kind of shows how, in a way, transnational families, like their like growth has kind of contributed to this change in gender roles, like just by like the sheer need for like the family to like stay like supportive of each other and for like the family to work. And I thought that was like a really interesting byproduct of, and it showed like a lot of like the changing times where like men are really having to take this much more parental role.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting shift from like Asian migrant workers from like the 1900s, where it's like men moving into the U.S. to work, and then while like the women back in the Asian countries would take over child-rearing roles, and the men do like the breadwinning roles, whereas now there's like a shift where the women do like money making, but then at the same time there's like also this like hint of like inequality where it's like they're making the money, but at the same time they still feel like, I guess like as a mother, like or as a woman, like they still have to find ways to care for their children in the countries where it's like the men almost is very rarely spoken of, and even like they would hire like other women to help take care of their children. And it's interesting how they Peng and Wong bring up that like finally having men do some of the work would be like good for their families and mental health.
Yeah, what you were saying about like how different this experience must have been for families in like the early 1900s. Like that is something that's really interesting to me because I'm like pretty interested in history personally, and that change in just like the increased isolation, like by the lack of technology that they had back then, that like really contributed to a lot of families back then like falling apart, and like men would go abroad and they'd like find like a mistress or something and they just ditch their families back at home. And I wonder like whether like having this increased line of communication and having just like more interconnectedness like that at least can help to prevent some of the challenges of having this like single parent go off, and like making sure that they're held accountable to their family and that they are able to like keep in touch and like remember like why it is that they're in why they're doing this and making this big step.
Yeah. So I guess like what you said about the technology helping like the parent and the children come closer together, but like at the same time, like with this new technology, it's also like both parents, like the worker, like male or female, and their spouse, like having like the same stronger ties that they had before one of them had moved. So yeah, this new.
There is a strain. I feel like we can all agree that there is a strain in like in feeling that you are responsible for taking care of your whole family, being the migrant worker, leaving your family behind, kind of going overseas, working hard, doing this and that. But do you guys feel that there's also a disconnect and there's kind of like an emotional strain as well on the parent that stays in the home country, feeling like my husband or my wife is away, even though we have all this like technological connections and stuff, and I can still call him and this and that, they still may feel like an emotional strain because their partner is away and they're the one that kind of has to keep the home in order, taking care of maybe 2-3 kids, their families. Like, do you feel like that strain is still as strong as the strain that the partner that leaves the country may feel?
I think it's almost like the grass is always greener on the other side. Like, the partner that's like in the country of origin may feel like I have to deal with like everything at home, and like you just have to worry about like work wherever your migrant country is. But then on the flip side, like the migrant worker can be thinking like, oh, I can't even like hold my child, whereas like the one at home can. So I feel like I can see like both sides of.
And also just in maintaining a relationship over that kind of distance. Like, I mean, I'm sure you guys have known people who attempt long distance relationships and things like that.
Attempt.
And
Attempt, not through attempt.
It's often attempt. And even like in our modern society, like you have FaceTime, you could just be like hours apart, like not even like across like time zones and across these huge distances, and like without the strain of like even having to support families or anything like that. Like there's already a lot of pressure on people who try to like who lose that kind of like intimacy and like connection that they have. And I imagine like on both sides of having like a family member or like a spouse or something go abroad, like that must put an incredible amount of strain on the family and just on like the psyche of like both parents involved.
Yeah. Which is that's actually a really interesting point because from all the most of the scholarly articles that we have read, it's mainly focusing on like the parent-child relationship and how it was almost like the family was defined in terms of like parent and child like relationships and ties. And it reminds me of the readings that we did on week 7 about transnational families, like the what is it? Transnational marriages? Or was that the term? From the book For Better or For Worse. And it seems like almost the overarching theme of all of the chapters that our classmates presented was that a lot of the couples in the book were getting married just for the sake of getting married and having a partner. So it makes me wonder if like the spouses that are in the transnational families with like the migrant worker away for such a long time, like if they have like a really really strong like loving bond with each other, is it they just got married just to get married type of thing?
I mean, back in history, there's a lot of couples that would just get married for the sake of status, prestige,
I guess old age.
Yeah, just old age. And I mean, a lot of those couples, I mean, I can't speak for all of them, but a lot of them that I read up on said that they eventually learned to love each other. And they eventually kept a relationship. But a lot of those relationships are more the love that they have for each other, not that they were in love with each other.
So like almost like this is my domestic partner, but not necessarily my romantic partner.
It was more like, this is my fate and I have accepted it, and we are married, and I will not do anything that will betray that trust or betray that relationship. But I mean, at the end of the day, they're not in love with each other. It's what they had to do for familial reasons.
Yeah, it's like almost a different definition of partner.
Yeah.
Because like if you like romantically like get into a relationship, like it typically just like starts with like attraction, like, and then you like build towards something like that. But when you're just like in an arranged marriage or something like that, for instance, there's a surprising amount like of arranged marriages that tend to just turn out fine, because essentially when you have all this cultural pressure on you, it's like you need to make this work. Like you're given a task, and when two people or even like a group of people, when like they both have to face challenges together, and when they both have to like face like the challenge of like raising a family or like moving together, you kind of grow this bond almost from a platonic place as well as possibly romantic if it works out that way. And I think a good comparison would be like almost like a cop partner, like a detective.
What?
Like, you know, like when you're assigned
White chicks?
Why cop though?
like when detectives are assigned like a partner in cases, like that can often be like a very close bond where you're like working long hours together. You're like going through everything. You're sharing like the same challenges, and like you're the only two people who can like relate to the same problems that each other have. And that can like grow into like a really like strong connection, just like from a platonic sense. And I think that's like a good comparison in terms of just showing how when you are when you're embracing like one of these transnational marriages, even if it's not from a place of love, it can still be a really strong connection, and it can be really good for helping a family cope with the challenges of living transnationally.
It could be from a place of like appreciation instead of love. Like, this person's risking a lot to provide for the family that we have. Maybe I'm not in love with that person, but I do love and appreciate for what that person is doing for our family, for the sake of our family.
So in the sense where they're thinking more about like sustaining the family instead of like sustaining this like relationship with another person, it's like thinking about like the whole family in a sense.
Yeah, but that's interesting talking about that. It reminds me of the other topic we wanted to discuss today, which was transnational like adoptions. And I think there are some comparisons to be made between transnational adoptions and like kind of having this like sort of this transnational marriage where like you're like forced into the situation, and like you're adopted at a young age or something like that, and you're like forced to like live this upbringing with like a family that's not familiar to you, and in a culture that's not familiar to you. And when you like grow and you like learn to like you like just from the sheer like closeness and like intimacy of like the relationship like in a adopted family, like you start to learn to like embrace some of the cultural and familial like identities that you might have in that new culture.
that goes for saying if transnational families took place, if the child that they're adopting is older and they kind of have already like a sense of the culture that they were born in.
Yeah.
If they were adopted at a much younger age, like an infant or maybe even a toddler, from them staying in being born in their home country, moving to another country, they might even adopt the traditions and the values and the beliefs that their adoptive parents have.
Yeah,
and believe
I
in.
meant adoption at like a later age.
Okay.
But when you're talking about adoption at a young age, that's also very interesting because there's like a whole different set of problems that can come with that because you can face discrimination for just like your appearance and just like from the simple fact that you were born in a different country, even if you've grown up culturally feeling like you're a part of the society that you moved to. And in some of the readings, that like there are some really tragic stories about some of the discrimination people would face, and just like the sheer feeling that people felt like they couldn't control this kind of discrimination because they like done everything right. They'd like grown up in the right culture, but it's just like base level discrimination, and that's like a really interesting problem.
Adoption rates have actually, or transnational, international adoption rates have actually dropped. I want to say, yes, 72% since 2005. Mainly, there were a lot of reasons that went into it, but Russian parliament actually voted to ban adoption by Americans in 2012. Mainly, there was this one story where this almost 12 or 2-year-old boy, he's 21 months, he's Russian. He was adopted by an American couple. The American couple brought him over and actually was on their way to take him to daycare, and I think they had another child, maybe their own biological child or another adopted child, but I think it was their own biological child. Brought the child to daycare and then left the adopted child in the back of his truck and continued to go to work after dropping his first child off at daycare. They went to work, or the father went to work, and just forgot the child in the back seat, and he actually died from heat stroke, from being left in the car for 9 hours. And it wasn't until a coworker passed by and saw his body in the truck. And just because of that, the Russians were incredibly furious and understood, because they actually said something that kind of struck a nerve that said, we keep giving the people of the West our children, and these things keep happening, and you just keep saying that it's an incident and you're sorry about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at that point, at a certain point, when you have enough really tragic stories like this, you have to wonder whether, almost not even like discrimination, but you almost might be feeling a sense of familial isolation from your adopted family if they're prioritizing their biological children over you, or if they just like seem more distant and not as like invested in like raising a child as they might have initially been, like just at the prospect of like raising a child in isolation rather than like when it actually comes time to actually do it.
Completely. I think that was one of the arguments that a lot of people took note on after they saw the article. They thought that the father just was completely neglecting their adopted child. After going through so hard to get that child, neglection just killed him. And that's what angered a lot of people, not just the Russians, but by Americans as well.
Mm.
Well, I guess. Sorry. Well, I guess even in cases where it's like, for example, Nicole Chung's "All You Can Ever Know," she talks about how like her adoptive parents were just like amazing parents, like they loved her so much, and she grew up like in a loving household. But then there was still part of her where, because she looked so different, like she was still having a hard time navigating kind of like her own identity and like where she belonged or didn't belong. And because her parents meant well to like raise her like quote unquote colorblind, like you don't see color, we love you, but because of that, like she still had trouble navigating kind of her like who she really was. And so then like adoption's like interesting in the sense where it's like, yeah, they're like bad cases, but then even in the cases where it's like the parents were very loving and did everything they could, like it's still hard for the adoptee. Is that what they call it? The adopted child adoptee.
Adopted.
I think so.
Yeah, to kind of grow up and like live with who they are.
My best friend actually, she was given up by her birth mom in the Philippines a day after she was born, and her parents now have been raising her for 24 years, and they love her dearly. Like, she grew up with a fantastic childhood. I don't think a lot of people kind of ask about her because she's Filipino, so she looks Asian. Her mom, or her adopted mom, is Chinese, and her father is white. So they don't really see that divide physically, but sometimes she does feel a little disconnected, but not to the point where it creates a big problem. Like, where she feels disconnected is like, oh, I want to understand more about my birth mom and understand the reasons why she did what she did. But it just kind of, I think it goes for everything, where it says everything varies depending on the family.
And it's almost like coming to terms with not knowing ever like anything about your birth family or like why they gave you up or whatever, and like navigating the boundaries about like where you currently are and like everything having to do with that.
I think that's part of what we've been learning this whole quarter about redefining the word family and kind of looking into it and seeing what it entails. And by us kind of going further, studying transnational families, it kind of gives us more knowledge on what family means to us, because it made us look back on our own experiences.
It's kind of going beyond like the picture of like the heteronormative like white middle class family. Like there's other extensions of family, and it's like more or less like a term that you can choose to claim for like your personal experience and where it applies to.
Yeah, some of the stories of these transnational families that we've been reading about, like this wide range of problems that they've all had to face. So many of these families just being able to overcome it and just go through challenges like this. It's really inspiring, and it gives you like a really strong sense of how like important like understanding like how transnational families can like work in a well way, and it just shows also just broadly just how important understanding these family struggles and issues can be.
Provides you a different perspective and kind of teaches us to be more open-minded and understanding of everyone's familial situations.
Yeah, completely. All right, that's about 45 minutes, so we're about to wrap up our discussion.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for tuning in, and it's been a great class.